He fell to 144. Then he lit up the league. That's the headline nobody saw coming. A player widely talked about as a top prospect slipping into the 5th round, only to turn a single game into a question mark over how the draft was evaluated. This isn't just about a number on a draft board. It's about a collision between scouting dogma, media narratives, and what actually happens when a player gets a real shot on an NFL field. People will tell you it was interviews, fit, or that he didn't humble himself enough. Others will point to leaks, personality takes, or a team's internal politics. There are threads of truth in all of that, and there are also explanations that sound more like spin. What matters is what happened next. A performance that forced critics to adjust, analysts to reevaluate, and fans to squint at the draft map in disbelief. Numbers, tape, dot, and relationships all collided in a way that exposed holes in the evaluation system and raised a sharper question. How much of a prospect's fate is shaped off the field? And how much is decided by what they actually do when the lights come on? In the sections that follow, I'll walk through the slide, the explanations that tried to justify it, the tape that argued back, and the game that changed the conversation. But first, let's start with the fall itself and why nobody could agree on what it meant. No one expected the fall to be that steep. Mock drafts had his name sprinkled across the first 2 days. Analysts debated whether he could sneak into round 1, and the buzz around his accuracy and poise only grew as the pre-draft cycle unfolded. Yet when the clock kept running and team after team passed, the reality set in. He wasn't just slipping, he was free-falling. Pick 144 wasn't simply lower than expected. It was the kind of gap that forces people to rethink what they thought they knew about draft evaluation altogether. To understand how jarring it was, you have to look at the numbers. His ESPN ranking compared to his actual draft spot created one of the biggest gaps in nearly 2 decades. A statistical outlier strong enough to spark debates on whether teams saw something the public didn't, or whether the public was seeing something the teams refused to believe. Analysts who had him firmly graded as a top-tier prospect suddenly had to explain why their boards didn't match the league's actions. And fans, they were split between calling it a mistake, calling it bias, or insisting that teams must have had information no one else did. But here's the truth. The slide wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple. Every explanation felt either incomplete or suspiciously convenient. Some insiders whispered about interview impressions. Others pointed toward fit concerns or comments taken out of context. Meanwhile, the tape, the thing that's supposed to matter most, didn't show a mid-round quarterback. It showed a passer who processed well, played through chaos, and delivered with accuracy under pressure. So why did the league see him as something different? That disconnect is what made his fall so polarizing. It wasn't just a valuation gap, it was a philosophical one. Was the league punishing confidence? Overreacting to rumors? Leaning too heavily on the politics of the interview room? Or did they truly believe 5 full rounds separated the player he was from the player he'd become? Whatever the reasoning, one thing became clear the moment his name was finally called. This wasn't a quiet selection. It was the beginning of a story people would keep coming back to. A story that wouldn't make sense until he stepped onto an NFL field and gave everyone something undeniable to look at. Once the shock of the draft fall settled, the explanations began pouring in from every direction, and none of them matched. That's what made this moment so strange. Usually, when a prospect drops, there's a clear, unified narrative. Medical concerns, bad interviews, inconsistent tape. But with him, the stories kept shifting depending on who you listen to. Almost like everyone had a piece of the puzzle, but no one had the full picture. Some reports claimed teams didn't like his interviews. But even those concerns sounded inconsistent. It wasn't arrogance, they said. It wasn't disrespect. It was something far more vague. that he didn't seem overly concerned with impressing the room, that he didn't hang on every word of evaluators, that he didn't try to shrink himself to fit the mold. In an industry where confidence is praised on the field, but sometimes questioned off it, that became a talking point more than anyone expected. Rumors suggested certain teams wanted him to play the role of the eager applicant rather than the composed competitor, and when he didn't, it rubbed some people the wrong way. Other narratives drifted toward scheme fit or personality fit. Those explanations sounded even thinner. Fit is usually about style of play, not whether a quarterback sits a certain way in a meeting. But suddenly, anonymous voices floated the idea that he wasn't the type of personality teams wanted behind closed doors. Yet when pressed, none of those claims came with specifics. Only impressions, feelings, interpretations that couldn't be verified. Then came the leaks. The stories about trick installs during interviews. The suggestions that he pushed back when something didn't add up. The idea that he questioned coaches instead of quietly nodding along. Depending on who was telling the story, that made him either uncoachable or simply unwilling to play political games. And that line, the one between honesty and defiance, became the foundation for the most dramatic narratives around his slide. But here's the critical part. None of these explanations connected cleanly to the tape. None explained why a quarterback with his accuracy, composure, and production dropped behind players with far shakier profiles. None explained why teams dismissed what he did under pressure, behind collapsing pockets, week after week. So instead of answers, what we got was noise, speculation layered on top of speculation until the real story was buried somewhere beneath it. And that's why the debate grew louder, not quieter. Because if the leaks were right, teams might have overvalued perception. If the leaks were wrong, someone was trying to shape a narrative that didn't belong to them. Either way, the drop didn't match the player. For all the noise swirling around his interviews, demeanor, and so-called fit, the one thing that refused to line up with the narrative was the tape. Anyone who actually watched him, not clips, not highlight reels, but full drives under real pressure, saw a quarterback dealing with some of the harshest conditions in college football and still finding ways to deliver. It wasn't polished comfort football. It was chaos, and he learned to operate inside it. The offensive line issues were well documented. Pockets didn't just collapse, they evaporated. He had games where pressure found him before routes fully developed, where sacks looked inevitable from the snap. Most quarterbacks panic in those situations. They backpedal, they rush throws, they spiral into mistakes. But his biggest trait wasn't a cannon arm or flashy mobility. It was control. He stayed calm. He reset. He processed quickly, and he consistently delivered the ball without turning it over. That's why so many analysts praised his accuracy. Not because he was throwing easy passes, but because he was throwing difficult ones with precision. Then there were the records, not padded stats, but franchise-level milestones. Completion percentage, single-season passing yards, touchdown totals, quarterback rating. Numbers that showed he didn't just survive adversity, he performed inside it. The AP ranking Colorado earned early in the season wasn't accidental. It came from a quarterback who turned a struggling team into something dangerous every time he touched the ball. Coaches and former players repeatedly highlighted how unusual it was for a QB to stay that consistent while taking that much punishment. Yet somehow, the tape became secondary during the draft cycle. Instead of discussing his pocket presence, the conversation shifted to personality impressions. Instead of his accuracy, people talked about whether he smiled enough in meetings. Instead of evaluating his command of an offense, some chose to focus on whether he seemed too confident for their liking. It was as if the film was inconvenient, evidence that complicated the narrative being built around him. And that's the strange part. The exact traits teams claim to value in quarterbacks. Resilience, accuracy, composure, toughness were right there on tape. Clear, repeated, undeniable. But the league treated it like background noise, as if the film was speaking too softly to be heard over the whispers. Those whispers wouldn't fully fade until the one moment that forced the entire conversation to shift. A moment where everything on tape suddenly showed up under NFL lights. When Cleveland finally stepped up and selected him at 144, it didn't feel like a casual mid-round flyer. It felt intentional, calculated, like a team that understood it wasn't just drafting a quarterback. It was stepping into a narrative that half the league was afraid to touch. That's why the Browns' interest didn't begin on draft day. Their evaluation had stretched across multiple encounters. Meetings at the Shrine Game, extended conversations at the Combine, a top 30 visit, and a private dinner attended by some of the most influential decision-makers in the organization. That alone made the pick unusual. Teams don't usually invest that level of time into a guy they see as a late-round project. But Cleveland wasn't just evaluating talent. They were evaluating opportunity. Their quarterback room wasn't stable. It was layered with uncertainty. A recovering veteran with a massive contract, a bridge quarterback, a depth option, a new offensive direction under a staff that knew if they didn't evolve quickly, they wouldn't last. All of that created a window, slim but real, for someone who didn't fit the traditional draft narrative, but did fit the one thing Cleveland desperately needed: accuracy and poise under pressure. There were also relationship threads woven quietly into the story. Reporters noted the connection between Shedeur Sanders and Browns personnel, including relationships that stretched back years. Some suggested that trust helped open doors for deeper conversations. Others argued it helped the Browns feel more confident in who he was beyond the headlines. None of that guaranteed a pick, but it created familiarity. And familiarity matters in a league where perception can overshadow performance. Still, even with all those touch points, selecting him meant going against the consensus. The Browns knew the questions they'd face. They knew the skepticism. They knew the leaks about personality and interviews were already shaping how people viewed him before he ever stepped into an NFL building. But they also knew something else. Draft value isn't real unless the player stays stuck where he's picked. And if a quarterback taken at 144 turned out to be better than players drafted 100 spots above him, no one would care how it looked on draft weekend. So Cleveland made the move, quietly, confidently, without trying to sell a narrative or defend a decision. They simply bet that talent and temperament would look different the moment the games began. And then came the moment that validated that gamble, the game that rewrote the conversation overnight. When he finally stepped onto the field as Cleveland's starter, the expectations weren't sky high. They were closer to desperate hope. Fifth-round quarterbacks aren't supposed to take over teams. They aren't supposed to rewrite narratives. They aren't supposed to become the spark that flips a franchise's momentum. But all it took was one game, one nationally watched performance, for everything people thought they knew about him to get ripped apart. It happened against Tennessee, a team known for muddying up games, dragging quarterbacks into ugly battles, and forcing young passers into mistakes they can't recover from. Add in the Browns' struggling run game, a defense having one of its worst outings of the season, and the pressure of proving himself in real time, and the stage looked more like a trap than an opportunity. But he walked in with the same calm he showed in college. The same command. The same willingness to stand in the pocket until the last possible moment and deliver a strike where only his guy could get it. By halftime, people were already refreshing their timelines. By the fourth quarter, the conversation had exploded. More than 300 passing yards, 3 touchdowns through the air, another on the ground, a level of efficiency and composure that didn't just exceed expectations, it dismantled them. And then the record surfaced. First Browns rookie ever to hit that statistical combination. One of the only quarterbacks in the Super Bowl era to deliver that precise mix of production in a single game. A performance that didn't need hype attached to it, because the numbers were loud on their own. But the real shift wasn't in the stats. It was in the tone of the national conversation. Analysts who dismissed him weeks earlier suddenly watched his processing, his accuracy, his control, and asked whether they'd misjudged him. Critics who mocked the idea of him starting began walking back their takes. Even some of the loudest skeptics admitted on air that whatever concerns teams once had clearly weren't showing up on Sundays. And for the first time since draft night, the question wasn't, why did he fall? It became, how many teams just made the mistake of their careers? Because this wasn't a fluke. It wasn't manufactured hype. It was the exact player people saw on tape, finally given the chance to show it on an NFL field. The moment his breakout game went public, something subtle but unmistakable happened. The excuses started to shrink. For months, people had leaned on vague explanations, personality concerns, interview impressions, supposed fit issues, to justify why a quarterback with his accuracy and production fell into the 5th round. But once he proved he could execute at a level that outshined top picks, the conversation shifted to something far more uncomfortable. Maybe the issue wasn't the player. Maybe the issue was the league's evaluation process. And that process, as history shows, isn't flawless. In fact, it sometimes rewards conformity more than competence. Rumors suggest some evaluators didn't like that he pushed back when something didn't make sense. Reports claim certain teams interpreted confidence as arrogance or saw his calm demeanor as disinterest. None of those interpretations were grounded in performance. They were grounded in perception. And perception has always been the most fragile part of drafting quarterbacks. What his rise exposed was how easily narratives can spiral when they are challenged. A single anonymous comment can become a talking point. A misunderstood interview can evolve into a red flag. A moment of honesty can be reframed as defiance. And before anyone stops to question the accuracy, the narrative calcifies, becoming fact simply because it's repeated often enough. His fall showed how quickly a reputation can be shaped by whispers rather than gameplay. There's another layer to this too, the politics of quarterback evaluation. Teams often say they value toughness, leadership, and mental resilience. But the league has a long track record of struggling with quarterbacks who don't fit its preferred personality template. Some analysts suggested that teams weren't sure how to interpret his directness. Others argued they didn't know where to place a player who carried himself like a franchise quarterback before the league had decided he could be one. And instead of embracing that confidence, parts of the system pushed back against it. His breakout didn't just challenge those assumptions, it embarrassed them. It forced evaluators to reckon with the possibility that they weren't measuring the wrong things. They were measuring the least important things. The tape was right. The numbers were right. The personality concerns were never clear enough to hold weight. And once he stepped onto the field, everything that actually matters in football, timing, accuracy, composure, decision-making, drowned out the noise. The league had its chance to define him, but after one game, he started defining himself. By the time the dust settled on his breakout performance, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The narrative that surrounded him for months wasn't built on what he did. It was built on what people assumed. And assumptions have always been the easiest way to get a quarterback wrong. His draft slide didn't reflect his ceiling, his talent, or even his resume. It reflected how quickly the league can overthink a prospect when the conversation drifts away from the field and into boardrooms, back channels, and anonymous whispers. But that's what makes his rise so compelling. He didn't fix the narrative by talking louder. He didn't campaign for respect. He didn't clap back at critics or defend himself in long interviews. He did the one thing that strips away speculation. He played. Under pressure, under doubt, under the weight of a draft position that didn't belong to a quarterback of his caliber. And with every throw, every read, and every decision, he forced people to confront the gap between how he was evaluated and who he actually is. His story isn't about proving people wrong. It's about revealing what happens when a system built on perception has to reckon with results. It raises a bigger question too, one that hangs over every draft cycle. How many talented players fall through the cracks because teams get caught up in narratives instead of performance? How many quarterbacks are judged more for their posture in a meeting than for their poise in a collapsing pocket? How much of draft evaluation is genuine insight, and how much is groupthink wrapped in comfortable language? His emergence doesn't just challenge the league's scouting process. It exposes the biases that sneak into it. Biases about confidence, about demeanor, about who a franchise quarterback should look or sound like before he ever gets a chance to show who he is. And when those biases go unchecked, players like him become cautionary tales, not because they failed, but because the evaluators did. So the next time someone asks how a fifth-round pick became the most talked-about rookie in football, the answer is simple. He didn't change. The perception did. The league finally caught up to what the tape had been showing all along. And now that the narrative has shifted, the only real question left is this. If one game was enough to rewrite his story, imagine what an entire season might do.